They ganged up against her, 4-to-1 cameras, capturing what they thought would be her downfall. Her composed response cut through their talking points. Suddenly they were the ones struggling to explain. A liberal TV panel thought they could humiliate Karoline Leavitt on their show. They had prepared their attacks down to the last detail, but by the end, it was the hosts who were left speechless. The glossy studio of The Morning Dialogue gleamed under bright lights, a modern set with sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Manhattan skyline, the kind of prestigious backdrop that implied authority, importance, legitimacy, the kind of set designed to make guests feel small and hosts look powerful. Rebecca Palmer sat center stage, her posture perfect, her blonde hair falling in practiced waves around her shoulders, her smile the same one that had graced magazine covers and network promos for over a decade. She wasn't just a host. She was an institution, a household name who had interviewed presidents, celebrities, and thought leaders. The kind of journalist who believed her questions weren't just questions. They were cultural statements. Flanking her like loyal lieutenants sat her 3 co-hosts, each with their own carefully crafted persona. Marcus Chen, the intellectual with rimless glasses and biting commentary, Tanya Roberts, the empathetic voice who could turn a concerned look into headline news, and Derek Wellington, the former sports anchor whose folksy charm masked a talent for the verbal takedown. They sipped from steaming cups emblazoned with the show's logo, making small talk as the makeup team made final touches. But their eyes told a different story. Focused, predatory, ready. The production assistant counted down from 5. Cameras pivoted into position. Red lights blinked on. It was 8:45 a.m., time for the segment they had been planning all week. We're back with more of The Morning Dialogue. Rebecca's voice carried the perfect balance of warmth and authority. After the break, we'll be joined by Karoline Leavitt, a spokesperson who has been making waves with her controversial statements on education and parental rights. She turned to Marcus, who nodded on cue. Yes, and I think viewers will be interested to hear how she defends positions that many education experts have called deeply troubling. Tanya jumped in right on script. Especially in light of recent protests by teacher groups who feel targeted by this rhetoric. The practiced concern in her voice matched the furrow in her carefully shaped brows. We'll get to the heart of it, Derek added, with the slight head shake he reserved for guests he considered misguided. Camera 3 panned across their faces, capturing the tableau of measured disapproval before cutting to commercial. Behind the scenes, the energy shifted instantly. Is she here yet? Rebecca asked, her smile dropping away like a mask removed. Makeup has her, the floor director confirmed, handing Rebecca a blue folder. Final prep notes from research. They found a few more quotes you can use. Rebecca flipped through the pages, marking sections with a sleek silver pen. This one's perfect, she murmured, sharing a look with Marcus, who leaned over to see. She'll never recover from that. In the makeup room down the hall, Karoline Leavitt sat still as a young woman applied powder to her face. Karoline was younger than most of their political guests, just 25, with a resume that included White House experience and a growing reputation as a rising voice in conservative circles. But this morning, in the makeup chair of The Morning Dialogue, she looked almost out of place. No designer clothes, no entourage, just a simple blue dress, a portfolio folder, and an expression that revealed nothing. 5 minutes, the makeup artist said, brushing a final touch of color to her cheeks. They're finishing the commercial break now? Karoline nodded. Thank you. Her voice calm, betraying none of the nerves that might be expected from someone about to face one of the most hostile panels in morning television. She checked her reflection once, straightened her dress, and picked up her folder. While down the hall, the hosts were already discussing how they would handle her responses. If she tries to pivot to talking points, I'll cut her off, Rebecca assured the others. Derek, you come in with the quote about teacher morale. Then Tanya hit the emotional angle with the letter from that principal in Michigan. They nodded, their choreography perfected over years of working together. Research says she gets flustered when interrupted, Marcus added, checking his tablet. So we don't give her time to build momentum. The floor director approached, holding up 3 fingers. 3 minutes. The hosts straightened their posture, adjusted their expressions, professionals preparing for a performance they had done hundreds of times before. In the green room, a production assistant approached Karoline. Ready, Ms. Leavitt? I'll walk you to the set. Karoline stood, gathering her folder. I'm ready. If she was intimidated by what awaited her, her voice gave no indication. They walked down the corridor past framed photos of famous guests, award ceremonies, iconic moments from the show's 15-year history. Designed to remind visitors of exactly whose territory they were entering, the assistant gave her a final brief. You'll be seated across from the hosts. Try to look at whoever is asking the question, and remember to wait for Rebecca to introduce you before speaking, as if she might forget basic television protocol, the condescension so casual it was almost certainly unconscious. The red light above the studio door blinked, signaling the end of the commercial break. The assistant opened the door. Good luck, she whispered, though her tone suggested luck wouldn't be enough. The studio was larger than it appeared on television, cameras positioned strategically to capture every reaction, every expression, lighting designed to flatter the hosts while keeping guests slightly overexposed. The audience sat in tiered seating, their faces a mix of curiosity and prejudgment. Rebecca looked up as Karoline entered, her smile professional, but her eyes calculating, assessing, like a boxer studying an opponent before the bell. Welcome, she said, loud enough for only Karoline to hear. We're looking forward to an interesting conversation. The way she emphasized interesting left a little doubt about what kind of conversation she actually had in mind. Karoline took her seat, placing her folder neatly on her lap. Thank you for having me. Her voice steady, her posture straight. Rebecca's eyes flickered briefly to the folder, a moment of curiosity before returning to her practiced smile, as the floor director raised his hand, counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The red lights on the cameras blinked on. The studio audience quieted, and Rebecca's expression transformed from calculating to welcoming, a transition so smooth it was almost imperceptible. Welcome back to the morning dialogue, she beamed at the camera. We're joined now by Karoline Leavitt, former White House Assistant Press Secretary and current spokesperson for the Coalition for Educational Freedom. She turned to Karoline, her smile never wavering. Karoline, thank you for being here. Karoline nodded politely. Thank you for having me, Rebecca. Her calm demeanor offering no hint of what was about to unfold. The hosts exchanged glances, settled forward in their chairs, a panel of judges preparing to deliver a verdict that had been written long before their guest had even arrived. Rebecca's smile tightened just slightly as she prepared to launch the first carefully crafted question, designed not to understand, but to undermine. Not to explore, but to expose. What none of them realized was that Karoline Leavitt had been preparing for this moment long before she received their invitation, and the ambush they had planned so meticulously was about to backfire in ways that would change not just one television segment, but the trajectory of careers, the perspective of viewers, and the conversation about media bias in America's increasingly divided landscape. But those revelations were still moments away as Rebecca Palmer leaned forward, eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly, and delivered her opening line like the first move in a chess game. She was certain she would win. Rebecca Palmer smiled warmly at the cameras, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. We're back with a special segment today, she began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had spent decades perfecting her on-air persona. Our next guest has made quite a stir recently with some controversial statements about education policy. The words controversial statements hung in the air, carefully chosen to prime the audience before Karoline could say a single word. The chyron at the bottom of the screen flashed with carefully selected text. Debate. Should parents control school curriculum? Framing the issue in the most divisive way possible, Rebecca turned to her co-hosts, who nodded on cue, their expressions a synchronized display of professional concern. Karoline, before we get into specific policies, let me ask you something more fundamental. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, the movement so practiced it appeared natural, though nothing on this set was ever truly natural. Why do you believe parents with no educational background should have more say than trained professionals about what children learn in school? The question wasn't really a question. It was a trap designed to force Karoline to either defend an extreme position she hadn't actually taken or waste precious airtime correcting the false premise. Karoline opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus cut in smoothly. And specifically, I'm curious about your comments at the Westlake conference last month, where you criticized school boards for, quote, pushing ideological agendas. Unquote, He adjusted his glasses, a gesture viewers had come to associate with his intellectual authority. "That's a serious accusation to make against dedicated education professionals." Karoline took a breath, her hands resting calmly on her folder. "I appreciate the question, but I think there's a misunderstanding about what I actually said." Tanya interjected before she could finish. "I'd like to share something if I may," her voice softening with practiced empathy. "We received a letter from a school administrator in Michigan who says rhetoric like yours has led to threats against teachers." She lifted a paper dramatically, though she had memorized the contents days ago. She writes, "The constant attacks on our professionalism have made many of my colleagues consider leaving the field entirely." Tanya looked up, her eyes wide with concern. "How do you respond to the real-world impact your words are having on educators?" Behind the cameras, the production team watched with satisfaction. The ambush was proceeding exactly as planned. Rapid-fire questions, mischaracterized statements, emotional appeals, all designed to keep their guest defensive, off balance, unable to present her actual views. The director nodded approvingly as camera 2 captured Karoline's reaction, looking for any sign of discomfort, any crack in her composure they could highlight later in promotional clips. But something wasn't working as expected. Karoline wasn't fidgeting, wasn't flustered. Her expression remained attentive but calm, as though she had anticipated every move in their carefully choreographed attack. Derek jumped in next, his folksy demeanor belying the sharpness of his question. "You know what I find interesting, Karoline," he said, with an exaggerated head tilt, "is that many of the same people who talk about parental rights in education also support budget cuts to public schools." He spread his hands in a gesture of confusion that had been rehearsed in front of mirrors and focus groups for maximum effect. "Isn't this really about undermining public education rather than improving it?" Rebecca nodded approvingly, as though Derek had just made a profound observation rather than delivered his pre-written line. "That's an excellent point," she turned back to Karoline. "It does seem like there's a disconnect there." In the control room, the executive producer spoke into his headset. "Keep pushing, she's not giving us what we need." The instruction relayed to Rebecca through the nearly invisible earpiece she wore beneath her perfectly styled hair. She gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement, barely perceptible to viewers, but clear to those who knew the signals. "You know what troubles me most," she continued, not waiting for Karoline's response to the previous questions, "is the impact this has on vulnerable students, particularly those from marginalized communities." She adopted the serious expression reserved for segments about important social issues. "When parents are given veto power over curriculum, history gets whitewashed, difficult but necessary conversations get silenced, and children learn a sanitized version of reality." She paused for dramatic effect. "Is that really what's best for the next generation?" The studio audience murmured in agreement. They had been prepped before the show, told this segment would feature a controversial figure with extreme views, their reactions now part of the performance. The camera panned briefly to capture nodding heads and troubled expressions before returning to Karoline, who still hadn't been allowed to complete a single thought in the 2 minutes since the segment began. Behind the scenes, producers were already preparing promotional clips for social media. Morning dialogue challenges education critic. Conservative spokesperson faces. Tough questions? They were crafting the narrative before the conversation had even happened, confident in how it would end. Rebecca glanced at the clock, 3 minutes into the segment. Time to deliver the knockout question, the one researchers had spent days crafting. "Karoline," she said, her tone shifting to one of grave seriousness, "your organization recently supported legislation that would allow parents to sue teachers for discussing certain topics in the classroom." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "History teachers in 3 states have reported receiving threats for teaching about slavery and civil rights." Her voice rose slightly in practiced indignation. "At what point do you take responsibility for the climate of fear your rhetoric has created?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions, connections, accusations. It wasn't designed to elicit information, but to create a moment. A viral clip of a conservative spokesperson, either defending the indefensible or fumbling through a denial. The hosts exchanged satisfied glances. They had done this dozens of times before to politicians, activists, authors, anyone who didn't fit the narrow bandwidth of acceptable opinion they had defined for their audience. The formula was simple but effective. Mischaracterize, overwhelm, moralize, then sit back and watch as their target scrambled to correct the record, only to come across as defensive or evasive. The audience loved it, the ratings proved it, but something was different this time. Karoline Leavitt wasn't scrambling, wasn't defensive, wasn't playing the role they had scripted for her. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her expression neither angry nor intimidated, but contemplative. As though she was observing their tactics with professional interest, the silence stretched for 2 seconds. 3. Rebecca shifted slightly in her chair, a nearly imperceptible movement, but one that betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't how guests usually responded. Karoline finally spoke, her voice calm, measured. "Rebecca, I think this conversation would be more productive if we started with what I've actually said, rather than how it's been characterized." She opened her folder, removing a single sheet of paper. "Would you mind if I clarified my position first before addressing these questions?" The request was reasonable, delivered without defensiveness, but it represented something dangerous, a guest attempting to take control of a narrative that had been carefully constructed without her input. Rebecca's smile tightened just slightly. "We have a lot to cover, and limited time," she replied smoothly. "But go ahead briefly," emphasizing the word briefly as a reminder of who controlled the segment. The cameraman zoomed in slightly, capturing the moment in tight frame, the tension now palpable as the carefully orchestrated plan began to show its first signs of unraveling. In the control room, the executive producer leaned forward, suddenly more interested. "Stay on her face," he instructed. "Something's different about this one." The producer couldn't name it yet, but years in television had taught him to recognize when a segment was about to take an unexpected turn. Rebecca Palmer had conducted over 2,000 interviews in her career, had faced politicians, CEOs, celebrities, had handled difficult guests and unexpected moments with unfailing poise. But something about Karoline's calm demeanor made her instincts flare with warning. The young woman across from her wasn't following the usual script, wasn't reacting with the defensiveness or flustered indignation that made for such satisfying television. Instead, she seemed to be assessing them, studying them, as though their panel wasn't the culmination of a media career, but merely an obstacle to be navigated. Rebecca gestured impatiently. "Please proceed," she said, her voice still professional, but with an undercurrent that regular viewers might recognize as the first note of tension in what should have been another routine takedown. What happened next would change not just the segment, not just the morning, but the trajectory of careers, the conversation about media bias, and the way millions of viewers perceive the stories presented to them as objective truth. Karoline looked directly into the camera, and with the composure of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, began to speak. "You recently suggested that parents should have more say in their children's education than government officials." Rebecca's tone hardened slightly, her eyes narrowing as she delivered the accusation framed as a question. "Don't you think that undermines the expertise of education professionals who have dedicated their lives to this field?" The question itself, a masterclass in media manipulation, positioning Karoline against dedicated teachers, against expertise, against professionalism. Before she could fully respond, the first co-host jumped in, just as they had rehearsed hours earlier. "And let's be honest about what this really means," Marcus added, with a dismissive wave of his hand, his rimless glasses catching the studio lights. "It's just a thinly veiled attempt to push certain ideologies and restrict important discussions in classrooms." His voice carried the weight of assumed intellectual authority, as though his opinion were simply objective fact. The studio audience responding on cue with murmurs of agreement, faces reflecting the concern they'd been primed to feel. Karoline opened her mouth to respond, but Tanya was already speaking, her voice carrying the practiced tone of empathetic concern that had become her trademark. "I have a quote here from your speech last month," she said, looking down at her tablet, deliberately selecting words out of context. "You said that some educators are imposing their personal beliefs rather than teaching fundamental knowledge." She looked up, her expression a perfect mixture of shock and disappointment. "Do you really believe that dedicated teachers, who often spend their own money on classroom supplies, are pushing some kind of sinister agenda?" The framing so distorted, so removed from Karoline's actual statement, that it barely resembled her original point. But correction would require time the hosts had no intention of providing. Derek completed the ambush, his folksy demeanor sharpening into something more aggressive. Many teachers have expressed that they feel attacked by rhetoric like yours. He leaned forward, intensity building in his voice. These are people working 60-hour weeks on salaries that barely cover their bills, and your movement paints them as villains. He shook his head with practiced disappointment. How do you respond to that? The questions came rapid fire, overlapping, interrupting, not seeking answers but reactions. The technique perfected over years, familiar to regular viewers who had watched countless guests wilt under the coordinated pressure from 4 different directions at once. Behind the scenes, the control room hummed with activity. Director calling camera switches, producer monitoring social media reactions, already seeing the first comments rolling in. Morning dialogue holding her accountable. Watch them take down another extremist. The formula was working perfectly. Viewers engaged, outrage building, exactly as designed. Karoline began to respond, her voice steady despite the onslaught. If I could just clarify, Rebecca cut her off with practiced precision, raising her hand in a gesture that looked reasonable on camera but was designed to silence. We have limited time and a lot to cover. She glanced down at her notes, a move that signaled to viewers she was being thorough, professional, prepared. When in reality, the notes contain pre-written follow-ups designed not to explore Karoline's answers, but to counter them regardless of content. Let's move on to your organization's position on curriculum transparency, Rebecca continued, not waiting for a completed thought. Critics say these so-called transparency bills are really just tools for censorship. She tilted her head in false curiosity. Isn't this really about removing books and topics that certain groups find uncomfortable? The question itself containing the answer they wanted viewers to accept. Marcus jumped in again, perfect timing born from years of collaboration. What's particularly concerning, he adjusted his glasses for emphasis, is how these efforts disproportionately target materials dealing with race, gender, and sexuality. He delivered the line with the confidence of someone stating irrefutable fact rather than contested interpretation. The audience nodding along, already accepting the premise. They hadn't let Karoline establish her actual position, but had already moved on to criticizing it. The technique as old as political television itself, but still startlingly effective when executed by professionals. Tanya's expression shifted to one of personal hurt, a look she had perfected for segments dealing with sensitive social issues. As someone who taught in public schools for 3 years, she began, though she had only been a substitute teacher briefly before her media career, I've seen firsthand how important it is for students to encounter diverse perspectives. She placed her hand over her heart, a gesture the camera caught perfectly. Don't these policies harm the very children you claim to be protecting? Derek nodded in agreement, adding immediately without pause, and let's not forget the practical impact, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had once used for sports commentary. Teachers in states with these policies are leaving the profession, classroom materials are being removed from libraries, and education rankings are falling. He leaned forward for emphasis. At what point do you acknowledge that this approach is actually harming education, not helping it? The barrage continued, each host building on the other's points, creating a wall of accusations, insinuations, and loaded premises that would require hours to properly address, let alone the 4 minutes allocated to the segment. In the control room, the executive producer nodded with satisfaction. This was good television, the kind that generated clips, mentions, engagement, the kind that would be discussed on other shows, social media comment sections, the kind that reinforced their viewers' existing beliefs while giving them the satisfaction of seeing those beliefs defended forcefully on national television. Rebecca glanced at the monitor, seeing they were halfway through the allotted time, and Karoline had barely spoken 20 seconds total. Perfect. The segment was going exactly as planned. They would wrap it up soon with a final challenging question, cut her off mid-answer if necessary, and move on to the next segment, leaving viewers with the impression that the conservative position had been thoroughly debunked without ever having been accurately presented. But something wasn't working as expected. The guest across from them wasn't showing the telltale signs of frustration, the defensive posture, the raised voice, the flustered attempts to correct the record. Instead, Karoline Leavitt sat calmly, her posture relaxed but attentive, taking mental notes of each distortion, each loaded question, each interruption, not as a victim of their tactics, but as someone studying them, cataloging them, preparing to respond when the moment was right. Rebecca noticed it first, a slight uncertainty flickering across her face. This wasn't following the usual script, the uncertainty quickly masked by professionalism, but not before Marcus caught it, exchanging a quick glance with his colleague, silently acknowledging that something was off. But they continued nonetheless, too committed to their planned approach to adjust midstream. "Your organization recently claimed," Rebecca pressed forward, reading directly from her notes now, "that certain curriculum materials were indoctrinating rather than educating." She looked up with practiced indignation. "That's an extremely serious accusation, essentially calling teachers propagandists rather than educators." She paused for emphasis. "What evidence do you have for such inflammatory claims?" Another loaded question, another trap designed not to elicit information, but to force their guest into either defending a simplified version of a complex position or backtracking and appearing weak, the audience waiting for the now familiar pattern: accusation, defensiveness, interruption, move on to the next accusation. But Karoline didn't follow the pattern. Instead, she watched them with the calm assessment of someone who recognized the game being played and had no intention of playing by their rules. The silence stretched for a moment too long, making the hosts shift slightly in their seats, the rhythm of their attack disrupted by her refusal to react as expected. Rebecca glanced at the producer off camera, receiving a subtle signal to push harder. "Do you have an answer?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight edge now. "Or should we move on?" The implied threat clear: answer now or lose your chance to speak. It was a technique that had worked countless times before, pressuring guests into rushed, imperfect responses that could then be picked apart or interrupted mid-thought. The control room leaned in collectively, producers, directors, technicians, all sensing that something unpredictable was happening on their carefully controlled set. The camera zoomed in slightly on Karoline's face, looking for any sign of discomfort, any crack in her composure that could be used in promotional clips. But what they captured instead was something they hadn't anticipated. Not anxiety, not anger, not frustration, but a calm, knowing recognition of exactly what was happening and what would happen next. "I'd be happy to answer," Karoline finally said, her voice clear and steady. "But I think it would be helpful for your viewers if we could have an actual conversation rather than what seems to be happening here." She gestured subtly toward the four hosts, the movement so slight it could almost be missed, but the implication unmistakable. She was calling attention to their tactics on their own show, in front of their own audience. The studio fell completely silent, the audience sensing a shift in the dynamic, the hosts momentarily frozen, unsure how to respond to direct acknowledgement of what was supposed to remain implicit, invisible to the average viewer. Rebecca recovered first, years of experience kicking in. "We are having a conversation, Karoline," she said with a tight smile, a rather direct one about some concerning positions. But the damage was already done. The curtain had been pulled back just slightly, the machinery exposed, and in that moment, the balance of power in the studio began its unexpected shift as Karoline Leavitt prepared to speak, not as the defensive target they had anticipated, but as someone who had walked into their studio knowing exactly what awaited her and had prepared accordingly. For a brief moment, silence fell across the studio, a rarity in a space designed to eliminate any pause or reflection. Rebecca glanced at her co-hosts, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. 15 years in television had taught her to recognize when a segment was veering off script. The control room was suddenly alert, producers shifting in their seats, director whispering into his headset. Something wasn't going according to plan. Karoline Leavitt sat perfectly still, hands folded neatly in her lap, not fidgeting, not nervous, not defensive. All the reactions they had expected, all the reactions their approach was designed to trigger, conspicuously absent. They had expected defensiveness, anger, perhaps even tears, the emotions their ambush tactics had reliably produced in hundreds of guests before. Instead, Karoline sat composed, her posture relaxed but attentive, eyes clear and focused, almost as if she had been expecting exactly what they had delivered, waiting patiently for this precise moment. "Do you have a response?" Rebecca finally asked, her voice slightly less confident than before, the practiced ease that had carried her through thousands of interviews now strained. Karoline tilted her head just slightly. I'd like to respond to all of these points if you'll allow me to speak without interruption. Her voice was calm, measured, not a request, but a statement. The implication clear. She had noted every interruption, every distortion, every loaded question, and was now calling attention to the pattern. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the subtle change in atmosphere. This wasn't how these segments typically unfolded. The guests usually played their assigned roles, desperate to defend themselves, talking faster as they were cut off, growing visibly frustrated as points were twisted. But Karoline wasn't playing the role, and the audience could feel it, a ripple of unexpected tension moving through the studio. The producer's voice came through Rebecca's earpiece. Don't let her control the narrative. Cut her off if she goes off message. Rebecca nodded almost imperceptibly, forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. We're all interested in hearing your perspective, the lie hanging in the air between them. Karoline knew they weren't interested in her perspective. The hosts knew they weren't interested in her perspective. And now, in a moment of uncomfortable clarity, the audience was beginning to suspect it too. Marcus shifted in his seat, fingers tapping lightly against his tablet. A nervous habit that emerged only when segments deviated from plan. Tanya's expression flickered from concern to something closer to wariness. Derek sat unnaturally still, the folksy demeanor momentarily suspended, the tension stretched like a rubber band, pulled to its limit, about to snap back with unexpected force. The studio lights seemed to burn brighter, the cameras more intrusive, the silence between words heavier. Karoline opened the folder in her lap, retrieving a single sheet of paper, the movement deliberate, unhurried. Before I address your questions, I think it might be helpful to clarify what I actually said, rather than how it's been characterized. Her voice remained even, but carried a subtle authority that hadn't been present before, or perhaps had been there all along, but was only now becoming apparent. Rebecca glanced at the paper with veiled concern. Unscripted elements were dangerous, especially from guests who weren't following the expected emotional patterns. We're running short on time, she said, the standard excuse used to maintain control. Perhaps you could just address the central question. Karoline smiled slightly. That's exactly what I'm trying to do, Rebecca, she replied, the subtle emphasis on the host's name, a small but noticeable shift in the power dynamic. Since you've spent the last 7 minutes describing positions I've never actually taken, I think your viewers deserve to hear what I've actually said about parental involvement in education. The control room erupted in urgent whispers. Are we letting her do this? Should we cut to commercial? Stay with it. This might get interesting. The executive producer leaned forward, his instincts for ratings momentarily overriding the planned narrative. Let it play out, he instructed, though he wasn't sure why. Something about Karoline's composure made him curious about what would happen next. In 15 years of producing the morning dialogue, he had overseen hundreds of takedowns, watched as politicians, celebrities, activists crumbled under the pressure of his host's questioning. But this felt different, and different was rare enough to be potentially valuable. Rebecca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She was losing control of the segment, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Go ahead, she said with forced graciousness, but we do need to be mindful of time. The camera caught her expression, a mixture of professional poise and growing wariness that would later become a popular internet meme. Karoline nodded, looking down at the paper. This is from my actual speech at the Westlake conference, the one Marcus referenced earlier, she began, her voice clear and measured. I said, education should be a partnership between qualified teachers and engaged parents, both bringing their unique perspectives and knowledge to create the best possible environment for learning. She looked up, meeting Rebecca's gaze directly. I also said, teachers bring professional training and expertise. Parents bring intimate knowledge of their individual children, and both perspectives are valuable and necessary. The words hung in the air, so reasonable, so measured, so different from how they had been characterized, that even the audience seemed surprised, murmurs rippling through the studio. The hosts exchanged quick glances. This wasn't what they had prepared for. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. But you've also criticized school boards for what you called ideological agendas. Attempting to steer back to familiar territory, Karoline nodded. Yes, I have criticized specific policy decisions made by specific school boards when those decisions prioritized ideological goals over educational outcomes. Her voice remained calm, conversational, just as I've praised school boards when they've made decisions that balance diverse community perspectives with educational best practices. She turned slightly to include the other hosts in her gaze. The nuance matters, doesn't it? The question itself, a subtle challenge to the simplified narrative they had constructed. Marcus cleared his throat. But your organization has supported legislation that would restrict certain topics from being taught. Trying to recapture the offensive position, Karoline didn't flinch. Our organization has supported transparency legislation that ensures parents know what materials are being used in their children's education. She corrected him gently but firmly. We've never advocated for banning topics, only for age-appropriate presentation and parental awareness. She paused briefly. There's a significant difference between saying parents should know what their children are learning and these topics should never be discussed. Wouldn't you agree? The question positioning her as reasonable and her critics as distorting her views, the strategy becoming clearer now, but too late for the hosts to counter effectively. Derek jumped in. But teachers have reported feeling threatened by this kind of rhetoric, his voice carrying less conviction than before. Karoline's expression softened. I've spoken with many teachers who feel caught in a political crossfire they never signed up for, her tone genuine, empathetic. That's exactly why constructive dialogue is so important, and why characterizing those we disagree with in the most extreme terms possible is so damaging to actual progress. The implicit criticism of their approach, delivered with such measured reasonableness that it was difficult to dismiss. Rebecca felt the segment slipping further from her control, 3 minutes remaining, and their guest, instead of being exposed as an extremist, was coming across as the most reasonable person on set. She tried another approach. But surely you must acknowledge that some of these parent-led movements have resulted in valuable educational materials being removed. Her voice carrying an edge of frustration now. Books by award-winning authors pulled from shelves, lessons about historical events being watered down. Karoline nodded thoughtfully. There are certainly examples of overreaction on all sides, just as there are examples of materials being introduced without proper consideration for developmental appropriateness. She maintained steady eye contact with Rebecca. That's why I've consistently advocated for processes that bring educators, parents, and community members together, rather than positioning them as adversaries. The camera caught Rebecca's expression, a mixture of frustration and grudging respect, that would later be described online as the exact moment she realized she wasn't dealing with an amateur. The studio audience was completely still now, watching with unexpected interest as the dynamic they had seen hundreds of times before, the powerful host's overwhelming and outmatched guest, transformed into something entirely different, a controlled demonstration of how media, narratives could be dismantled from within. First, Karoline began, her voice steady. I noticed that none of you actually quoted my full statement, only the fragments that fit your narrative. The words landed with quiet precision, not accusatory but matter of fact, an observation rather than an attack. Yet the impact rippled through the studio, more powerful for its restraint. Rebecca blinked, a nearly imperceptible reaction, but the cameras caught it, the momentary loss of composure from a woman famous for never showing weakness. Karoline reached into her portfolio, removed a single sheet of paper, different from the one she had referenced earlier. May I read what I actually said? She asked, the question polite but firm, not seeking permission so much as highlighting the reasonable nature of her request. Rebecca shifted in her chair, the movement subtle but revealing. We're short on time, but her standard deflection suddenly sounding hollow, even to her own ears. It will only take 30 seconds, Karoline replied with a smile that was somehow both polite and unyielding, control of the segment slipping further, with each measured word she spoke, the production assistant's voice urgent in Rebecca's earpiece. 1 minute 45 left in the segment. A reminder of how little time remained to salvage what was quickly becoming a public relations disaster. The host's smile tightened, but before she could respond, Karoline had already begun reading, her voice clear, confident, unhurried. Education works best when we respect the expertise of teachers while acknowledging that parents have both the right and the responsibility to be involved in their children's learning. Transparency isn't about censorship or control. It's about partnership, communication, and trust. She looked up, meeting Rebecca's gaze directly. The full context matters, doesn't it? The question itself, a gentle indictment of the deliberate distortions that had preceded it. Marcus attempted to interject. But your organization specifically supported legislation that, if you're referring to the Educational Transparency Act, Karoline interrupted smoothly, the first time she had cut off a host, the reversal so unexpected that Marcus fell silent. That legislation simply required schools to make curriculum materials available for parental review, something 72% of Americans support according to Gallup's most recent polling. She set down the paper, her movements deliberate, calm. Now, she continued, setting down the paper, I'd like to address the claim that parents having a voice somehow undermines educators. Her argument was measured, thoughtful, backed by data, personal experiences, and examples that resonated beyond political divides. When parents and teachers work together rather than being positioned as adversaries, educational outcomes improve dramatically. She cited research, statistics, her command of the facts unwavering. The University of Chicago study found that schools with strong parent-teacher partnerships saw 40% higher reading scores and 30% higher math achievement, regardless of socioeconomic factors. The studio audience leaned forward, engaged in a way they hadn't been during the host's choreographed attacks. Rebecca tried to interrupt. But surely you must admit, I wasn't finished, Karoline said pleasantly but with unmistakable firmness. You've had several minutes to present your perspective. I believe I'm entitled to the same courtesy. The request so reasonable yet so contrary to the show's standard approach that Rebecca found herself momentarily speechless. The studio fell silent. Even the crew behind the cameras frozen in unexpected attention. The balance of power shifting visibly. The hunters becoming the hunted. Tanya glanced at Rebecca, seeking guidance on how to proceed, finding none. Derek shuffled his notes nervously. The folksy persona entirely abandoned now, Karoline continued, her expression composed. I've spoken with hundreds of teachers across the country, and the majority say the same thing. Her voice carried genuine passion now, not the manufactured outrage of morning television, but authentic conviction. They want parents involved, engaged, supportive. They don't fear transparency. They welcome partnership. She leaned forward slightly. The narrative that parental involvement threatens educational quality isn't coming from classrooms. It's coming from media segments like this one. The words landed like a grenade tossed casually into the center of the set. The accusation hanging in the air, impossible to dismiss or deflect, because it was happening in real time before a live studio audience and millions of viewers at home. The control room erupted in barely controlled chaos. 30 seconds left. Should we cut her off? Do we go to commercial? The executive producer held up his hand, silencing the panicked questions. Stay with it, he ordered, his instinct for compelling television overriding concern for the host's dignity. This is ratings gold. On set, Rebecca attempted to regain control. We appreciate your perspective, Karoline, her voice carrying the practiced tone used to signal the end of a guest's speaking time. But we need to... I noticed something else interesting, Karoline continued as if Rebecca hadn't spoken, her confidence growing with each moment. In preparing for this interview, I reviewed the last 20 segments you've done on education policy. She paused, letting the implication sink in that she had come not just prepared, but strategically armed. Every single one presented parent advocates as extremists trying to censor education, while none featured the thousands of teachers who support increased parental involvement. She tilted her head slightly. That's not journalism, it's advocacy, and your viewers deserve to know the difference. The camera caught the expressions of all four hosts. The moment of realization that the segment designed to diminish and dismiss Karoline Leavitt had instead become a platform for her to expose the very mechanics of their manipulation. Rebecca's professional smile faltered completely, replaced by something rarer on morning television. Genuine shock. The producer's voice came urgently through her earpiece. Wrap it now, get to commercial. But even as Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, Karoline continued, her timing impeccable, her focus unwavering. I came here today knowing exactly what to expect, not because I'm psychic, but because your show follows the same formula with every guest who doesn't share your perspective." She gestured to the notes in front of the hosts. "Mischaracterize their position, attack the mischaracterization, cut them off when they try to correct the record, then move on before viewers realize what happened." The words delivered not with anger, but with calm clarity, like a surgeon precisely identifying a pathology. "The question isn't whether we disagree, it's whether you're willing to have an honest conversation about those disagreements." The studio audience sat in stunned silence, some exchanging glances of surprise, others nodding in recognition of a dynamic they had subconsciously registered but never seen, articulated so directly. One man in the third row actually applauded before catching himself, the sound echoing awkwardly in the silent studio. Marcus attempted one final deflection, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "We simply ask challenging questions, Karoline. That's what journalism is about." Karoline smiled, not unkindly. "Challenging questions seek answers, Marcus. What you're doing is making statements disguised as questions. There's a difference. The distinction so clear, so obvious, yet rarely acknowledged on morning television, where performance had long ago replaced inquiry. The camera panned across the hosts' faces, capturing their expressions in high definition. Rebecca's forced composure, Marcus's thinly veiled irritation, Tanya's uncomfortable shifting, Derek's complete abandonment of his folksy persona. A tableau of media personalities suddenly stripped of their usual advantages in a game they had created but could no longer control. The control room was in barely contained chaos. The director speaking rapidly into his headset. "Camera 3, stay on the hosts. Camera 1, tighten on Karoline. 10 seconds to commercial break." The executive producer stood now, watching with a mixture of professional concern and reluctant admiration. In 15 years of producing morning television, he had never seen anything quite like this. A complete inversion of the power dynamic they had so carefully constructed. Rebecca made one last attempt to salvage what remained of the segment. "We appreciate your perspective, Karoline." Her voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional composure. "But we're out of time for today." She turned to the camera, the movement slightly too abrupt, betraying her eagerness to end the exchange. "We'll be right back after these messages," her signature sign-off line delivered, without its usual confident smile. But Karoline wasn't quite finished. Just before the cameras cut away, she delivered her final observation, her voice clear enough to be captured perfectly. "Isn't it interesting how we always seem to run out of time just when the conversation gets uncomfortable?" The question hanging in the air as the red lights on the cameras blinked off and the program cut to commercial, leaving millions of viewers at home suddenly seeing the familiar morning show in a very different light and setting social media ablaze with conversation about what they had just witnessed. A takedown indeed, just not the one anyone had expected. "What concerns me most," Karoline continued, her confidence growing with each word as the commercial break ended and cameras focused back on the suddenly tense set, "isn't that we disagree on policy, it's that this show presented me as someone with extreme views without ever actually engaging with what I've said." She turned to look directly at Rebecca, her gaze steady, unwavering. "Your researchers pulled quotes out of context, ignored the nuance in my position, and framed this segment from the beginning as an opportunity to expose rather than discuss." The accusation hung in the air, not delivered with anger or indignation, but with the calm certainty of someone who had come prepared with evidence. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the movement subtle but noticeable to the millions now watching with rapt attention. "I think that's an unfair characterization of our process," she replied, her voice lacking its usual authority. "We simply try to ask challenging questions." Karoline nodded as if considering this. "I reviewed the pre-interview notes your producer sent," she said, reaching for her folder again. "The document literally describes this segment as an opportunity to challenge dangerous conservative talking points and expose the extremism behind parent choice rhetoric." She held up a printed email, the morning dialogue letterhead, clearly visible. "That doesn't sound like preparing for a discussion. It sounds like planning an ambush." One of the co-hosts attempted to defend themselves, Marcus leaning forward, his expression tightening. "We're simply asking the tough questions that—" "No," Karoline interrupted, her tone still controlled, but carrying unmistakable authority now. You prepared an attack, not questions. There's a significant difference. She gestured to the notes in front of each host. Your questions weren't designed to understand my position. They were crafted to discredit it regardless of what I actually said. The control room erupted in panic, producers frantically speaking into headsets, the director calling for different camera angles, trying to minimize the damage unfolding live. But there was nowhere to hide, no camera angle that could soften the uncomfortable truth being spoken on their own carefully controlled set. That's a serious accusation, Rebecca countered, attempting to regain some semblance of control. We research all our guests thoroughly to ensure informed conversation. Karoline smiled slightly. Let's test that, shall we? She turned to face each host in turn. Can any of you name 3 specific policies my organization has actually proposed? Not characterized, not summarized, but actually proposed? The question hung in the air, the silence that followed more damning than any response could have been. None of the 4 hosts spoke, their eyes flickering to their notes, searching frantically for information they had never bothered to obtain. That's what I thought, Karoline said softly, not triumphant but simply resigned. You came prepared to attack a caricature, not engage with actual ideas. The audience stirred uncomfortably, some nodding in recognition, others shifting in their seats as the reality of what they were witnessing began to sink in. Tanya attempted to redirect, her practiced empathetic expression now seeming hollow, artificial. I think what viewers care about is the impact these policies have on children, Karoline nodded. Exactly, which is why misrepresenting those policies does such a disservice to public understanding. She turned slightly to include the audience in her gaze. Your viewers deserve accurate information so they can form their own opinions, not pre-packaged narratives designed to tell them what to think before they've heard all perspectives. Rebecca's face flushed slightly with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. This was not how these segments were supposed to go. Guests were meant to be defensive, reactive, not calmly dismantling the very foundation of the show's approach to confrontational interviews. We present multiple perspectives on this show, she insisted, her voice hardening, and we're simply challenging yours. Karoline tilted her head slightly. Do you, though? Present multiple perspectives. She asked the question with genuine curiosity. Because I examined your last 30 segments on education policy and parental rights. She referenced notes in her folder. 28 featured critics of parental involvement, 2 featured supporters, and even those 2 were interrupted an average of 12 times more than the critics. On this specificity of the analysis, the clear preparation and research, stood in stark contrast to the host's approach, and everyone in the studio knew it. This isn't about whether we agree or disagree, Karoline continued, her voice measured but firm. It's about media responsibility, the obligation to present issues fairly so viewers can make informed decisions. She gestured to the cameras, the screens, the entire apparatus of morning television. What happens on shows like this matters. It shapes public perception, discourse, policy, and when that influence is used to caricature rather than illuminate complex issues, everyone loses. The words resonated through the studio, landing with particular force because they weren't delivered as an attack, but as a principled observation about journalistic ethics and responsibility. Derek, who had remained uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke, his folksy manner completely abandoned. You came here prepared for this. It wasn't a question, but an accusation. Karoline met his gaze directly. Of course I did, her candor disarming in its simplicity. Just as you prepared to discredit me, I prepared to defend not just myself, but the integrity of a conversation that affects millions of families. She paused, letting the words settle. The difference is, I researched your actual positions while you created a straw man of mine. Rebecca's producer was practically shouting in her earpiece. 2 minutes left, cut her off, move to weather. But Rebecca hesitated, aware that abruptly ending the segment now would only confirm everything Karoline had said about their unwillingness to engage in real dialogue. The executive producer stood in the control room, watching with a mixture of professional horror and reluctant respect. She came ready for war, he muttered to no one in particular. And we brought water pistols. On set, Rebecca attempted one final redirect. Let's focus on the specifics of your policies, she suggested, as though this had been her intention all along. What exactly are you proposing for schools? A reasonable question, the first one of the entire segment, but coming so late it seemed almost desperate. Karoline nodded appreciatively. Thank you for asking, her response gracious, acknowledging the shift to more substantive territory. We advocate for 3 core principles. She began outlining clear, specific policies, backed by research, examples, outcomes, speaking directly to the camera, to the audience at home, bypassing the hosts entirely, presenting her actual perspective for the first time since the segment began. The audience leaned forward, engaged, interested, no longer watching a blood sport, but listening to ideas presented without the filter of manipulation. Rebecca glanced at her co-hosts, at the clock, at her notes, the segment slipping further from her control with each passing second. But there was nothing to be done. Interrupting now would only validate everything Karoline had said about their tactics. The producer's increasingly urgent voice in Rebecca's earpiece. 30 seconds, wrap it! Now, Rebecca cleared her throat. We're almost out of time, she said, trying to reclaim her authoritative tone. Thank you for joining us today, Karoline. The standard dismissal delivered with forced politeness, but Karoline wasn't ready to be dismissed. Before we end, she said, her voice still measured but firm, I'd like to extend an invitation. She turned to face Rebecca directly. I'm hosting a panel next month with teachers, parents, administrators, and students discussing collaborative approaches to education reform. I'd welcome your participation, a chance for all perspectives to be heard, respectfully and completely. The invitation itself a masterstroke, positioning Karoline as open to dialogue while implicitly highlighting the contrast with the morning dialogue's approach. Rebecca blinked, caught completely off guard. I'll have my producer look at my schedule, she managed, the response weak, non-committal, but the damage was done. The contrast between the 2 approaches could not have been more stark. The red light on camera. One began blinking, signaling 10 seconds to the hard break. Rebecca turned to the camera, summoning what remained of her professional composure. That's all the time we have for this segment. We'll be back with weather and traffic after this. Her voice carrying none of its usual confidence as the show cut to commercial, leaving viewers not with the takedown they had been promised, but with something far more valuable, a rare glimpse behind the curtain of how morning television shapes narratives, controls conversations, and manufactures consensus, all while claiming to simply ask questions. In the stunned silence that followed, as microphones were temporarily muted, Rebecca turned to Karoline, her expression a mixture of irritation and begrudging respect. That was quite a performance, she said, voice low. Enough that only those on set could hear. Karoline shook her head slightly. Not a performance, Rebecca, just preparation. She began gathering her notes, as calm in victory as she had been under attack. There's a difference, the distinction hanging in the air between them as crew members rushed to prepare for the next segment, and executives in the control room began the frantic process of damage control. The segment ended abruptly, cut short by a producer's desperate go to commercial. The transition to advertisement more rushed, more awkward than anything the morning dialogue had aired in years, but it was too late. Within minutes, clips were circulating online, shorter segments extracted from the full exchange, spreading across platforms like wildfire. Karoline Leavitt exposes liberal media bias on live TV. Watch. The morning dialogue hosts silenced by their own guest. Most awkward TV moment of the year. Conservative guest flips the script. Morning show ambush backfires spectacularly. Each clip more damaging than the last, capturing the precise moments when the host's expressions shifted from confidence to concern, from authority to uncertainty, from control to barely concealed panic. The most viral showing Karoline's calm dismantling of their pre-planned attack, juxtaposed with Rebecca's increasingly strained attempts to regain control of her own show. Social media exploded with reactions, the segment generating more comments, more shares, more engagement in 30 minutes than the show usually saw in a week. Viewers from across the political spectrum weighing in on what they had witnessed. I don't agree with her politics, but wow, she just exposed exactly how these shows work. Has anyone ever seen Rebecca Palmer that rattled before? Ever? This is why I stopped watching morning TV years ago. They invited her on to embarrass her, and ended up embarrassing themselves. The conversation was no longer about education policy or parental rights or curriculum transparency. It was about media itself, about how information is presented, packaged, controlled. Rebecca stormed off, set the moment cameras cut, yanking her microphone off with uncharacteristic force, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "Who approved this guest?" she hissed at a nearby producer who seemed to physically shrink under her glare. "Who let her bring those notes?" But even as she demanded answers, a part of her knew the truth. They had invited Karoline expecting an easy target, a young conservative voice they could easily discredit. They had done it dozens, perhaps hundreds of times before. With guests across the political spectrum who didn't fit their narrative, the formula had always worked, until today. Marcus paced near the edge of the set, fingers tapping against his thigh, a nervous habit he carefully controlled on camera, but now displayed without restraint. Tanya sat frozen in her chair, staring at her tablet where notifications were already pouring in from colleagues, friends, followers, all asking variations of the same question. Did that really just happen? Derek had vanished entirely, retreating to his dressing room without a word, leaving his notes still scattered across the desk. The floor director approached Rebecca cautiously. "We need you back on set in 3 minutes for the weather lead-in." She nodded mechanically, years of professionalism kicking in, despite the turmoil roiling beneath the surface. "I'll be there," her voice clipped, tight, as a makeup artist rushed to touch up the foundation that had begun to crack under the heat of studio lights and unexpected pressure. On the other side of the set, Karoline gathered her materials unhurried, her movements as measured as her words had been. A production assistant approached tentatively, as though approaching a dangerous animal. "Ms. Leavitt, we'll need your microphone." Karoline smiled kindly, unclipped the device, handed it over with a polite, "Thank you." Her composure unshaken even now, when cameras were off, when viewers couldn't see, offering the same measured presence she had maintained throughout the confrontation, suggesting this wasn't a performance at all, but who she actually was. The realization somehow making what had just occurred even more extraordinary. The executive producer had already retreated to his office, door locked, phone pressed to his ear, engaged in urgent conversation with network executives who had watched the segment with growing horror. "It's not as bad as it looks," he insisted, knowing the words were a lie, even as he spoke them. "We can control the narrative in the follow-up, maybe do a segment tomorrow on media fairness." But even as he proposed damage control strategies, alerts continued to flood his phone, the clip spreading beyond social media now, picked up by news aggregators, media watchdogs, and competing networks who recognize both the viral potential and the rare opportunity to highlight a competitor's failure. In the green room down the hall, the producers for upcoming segments huddled around a monitor, watching the carnage unfold on social media in real time. "They're going to reshoot the whole format after this," one whispered, the others nodding in agreement. Heads will roll, because everyone in television knew the unspoken rule. Hosts could be aggressive, confrontational, even rude, as long as they maintained control, as long as they won. Losing, especially losing so completely and publicly, was unforgivable. As Karoline was escorted toward the exit, she passed a wall of monitors displaying various channels, one already showing her image, a competitor network running the headline, "Morning TV Ambush Backfires." She didn't smile, didn't react, maintained the same composed expression she had shown throughout the interview. A producer from a later segment watched her pass, whispering to a colleague, "She knew exactly what she was doing from the moment she walked in." The realization spreading through the studio. They hadn't just underestimated her, they had completely misjudged who she was, what she was capable of, and the price for that miscalculation was now being tallied in real time across social media, network conversations, industry gossip, and viewer reaction. Outside in the Manhattan morning, Karoline stepped into the sunlight. The contrast between the artificial environment of the television studio and the authentic bustle of the city seemed suddenly significant. Her phone already vibrating continuously with messages, calls, interview requests from outlets that had previously ignored her, now suddenly interested in the woman who had dismantled one of television's most formidable hosts on her own show, using her own tactics against her. A car waited at the curb, driver holding the door. Karoline paused before entering, took a breath. This moment of quiet, possibly the last she would have for days, as the machinery of media attention now shifted to focus on her. But unlike the hosts she had just faced, she seemed prepared for this too. Back in the studio, Rebecca Palmer had returned to set, makeup refreshed, expression controlled, prepared to continue as though nothing unusual had happened, as though the previous segment hadn't just undermined her carefully constructed image of journalistic authority and control. The floor director counted down. Cameras repositioned, red lights blinked on, and Rebecca smiled into the lens. Welcome back to the Morning Dialogue. Let's check in with meteorologist Jeff Barnes for today's weather outlook, her voice carrying almost its usual confidence, a testament to years of professional training, but viewers noticed the difference, the subtle strain around her eyes, the slightly too tight grip on her notes, the way she avoided referencing the segment that had just concluded, as though by not acknowledging it, she could somehow erase it from reality. But reality was already beyond her control, clips continuing to multiply across platforms, commentary building, analysis spreading. What had been intended as a routine takedown of a conservative voice had transformed into something entirely different, a moment of unexpected authenticity in a landscape designed to prevent it, a glimpse behind the curtain that couldn't be unseen, the morning show machine suddenly visible in all its calculated artifice. Behind closed doors, network executives were already gathering, emergency damage control meetings being scheduled. Should we release a statement? Do we acknowledge it at all? How do we frame this tomorrow? They had built careers on controlling narratives, yet now found themselves on the receiving end of a narrative they couldn't control. The show's social media accounts were flooded with comments, viewers calling out the bias, the unprofessionalism, the clear attempt to ambush rather than engage, many coming from longtime viewers who described themselves as liberal or progressive, but who recognized the fundamental dishonesty of what they had witnessed. I've watched this show for years, but I've never seen them exposed like this before. This wasn't journalism. It was an attempted public execution that backfired spectacularly. I don't agree with her politics, but I respect how she handled that ambush. The conversation transcending political divides, touching on something more fundamental. Media integrity, transparency, honesty. By afternoon, major news outlets were covering the incident, not for the content of the political discussion, but for what it revealed about media tactics. The curtain had been pulled back and the machinery exposed. Opinion pieces already appearing online, with titles like The Morning Dialogue's Mask Slips and What Karoline Leavitt Revealed About Morning TV, the consensus building across publications that, regardless of one's political perspective, what had unfolded that morning was a rare moment of unplanned transparency in an industry built on carefully constructed illusions. In the days that followed, a transformation began, not just for the Morning Dialogue, but for political discourse more broadly. What had started as a routine segment, a familiar formula executed hundreds of times before, had become something unexpected, a moment of authentic revelation that continued to resonate long after the studio lights dimmed. Karoline's appearances on other shows skyrocketed, requests pouring in from podcasts, radio programs, cable news outlets, and digital platforms, all suddenly interested in the woman who had remained calm in the center of a media storm, her composed dismantling of the ambush resonating with people tired of performative outrage, tired of manufactured conflict, tired of being told what to think rather than being shown how to consider. Across social media, comment sections, the conversation evolved, moving beyond the specific exchange to examine the broader landscape of political coverage. Viewers sharing similar examples from other shows, moments when guests were interrupted, mischaracterized, set up to fail rather than invited to explain. I've been watching morning TV for years, and I never noticed how they do this until now. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. They do this to everyone who challenges their narrative. I counted the interruptions on yesterday's interview, 23 times in 7 minutes. The audience no longer passive consumers, but active analysts questioning techniques they had previously accepted as simply how television worked. Rebecca Palmer issued a carefully worded statement, neither apology nor acknowledgement, but a vague recommitment to journalistic standards and respectful dialogue, the words ringing hollow in light of what viewers had witnessed. But even as she attempted to move past the incident, viewers noticed a change in her approach. Questions less leading, more open, fewer interruptions, more space for responses, subtle changes perhaps imperceptible to casual viewers, but obvious to those who watch closely, who recognized a professional adapting out of necessity, not conviction. The network executives held closed-door meetings, reviewing format, research, ratings, and response, weighing options, considering changes, ultimately deciding against any public acknowledgement of what had transpired, hoping the moment would fade from public memory, replaced by the next viral clip, the next controversy, the next cycle of outrage and attention. But even as they strategized behind closed doors, something had fundamentally shifted, like a crack in a foundation, invisible on the surface but altering the structural integrity nonetheless. Marcus Chen, the intellectual co-host, found himself facing unexpected pushback on social media from his own followers. "You never let her answer a single question. I used to think you were the thoughtful one. Do better next time or lose my viewership." The criticism coming not just from conservatives but from his own ideological allies, who had recognized the fundamental unfairness of the approach they had witnessed. He sat in his apartment late one evening, scrolling through comments, the realization slowly dawning that his reputation, his credibility, carefully built over a decade, could be undermined in an instant by a moment of exposure. The production team met to review protocols, new guidelines emerging, never explicitly connected to the Karoline Leavitt interview, but clearly inspired by its fallout. Research subjects' actual positions, not just critiques, ensure guests have adequate time to respond, avoid multiple hosts speaking over guests, small adjustments to prevent another such incident, another such revelation of the machinery behind the performance. The incident became a case study in journalism classes, professors showing the clip, analyzing the techniques, the assumptions, the manipulations, a warning about the dangers of sacrificing integrity for ratings, students taking notes, recognizing patterns they might have missed before, patterns they would now be unable to ignore in their own media consumption. For Karoline, this wasn't about victory or vindication. It was about something more fundamental, the right to be heard fairly, to have ideas engaged with honestly regardless of political perspective. And when asked about the interview in subsequent appearances, she spoke without bitterness or triumph. "My goal wasn't to embarrass anyone," she explained on a podcast the following week. "It was simply to ensure that viewers heard what I actually believe rather than a caricature." Her refusal to gloat or capitalize on the host's humiliation only enhanced her credibility, making her seem not like a political operative, but like someone genuinely concerned with the quality of public discourse. Many reached out to her, including some who deeply disagreed with her politics but respected her dignity under fire. A liberal education professor emailed, "While I don't share your views on curriculum policies, I was impressed by your handling of that interview and would welcome a real dialogue, a conversation that would later lead to an unexpected collaboration, bridging perspectives that media coverage typically portrayed as irreconcilable, proving that authentic engagement could accomplish what performative conflict could not. The saddest part," she said in a later interview, "isn't that they tried to make me look bad. It's that they didn't think viewers were smart enough to recognize what they were doing." The observation cutting to the heart of what had resonated so deeply about the original exchange, the implicit condescension in assuming viewers wouldn't notice the manipulation, wouldn't care about the distortion, wouldn't value truth over performance. 3 weeks after the interview, a media analysis firm published a report documenting a measurable shift in how political guests were treated across morning television programs. Fewer interruptions, more substantive questions, less gotcha journalism, more policy discussion. Not a revolution, but an evolution driven not by ethical awakening, but by fear of similar exposure, fear of becoming the next viral example of media manipulation laid bare. The morning dialogue continued, the set unchanged, the format familiar, the hosts still in their places, yet something fundamental had shifted. Viewers now watched with different eyes, saw the techniques, the framings, the subtle manipulations that had always been there, but had previously remained invisible, background noise accepted as normal, now brought into focus, impossible to unsee. When Karoline Leavitt launched her education initiative 2 months after the interview, it received coverage across the political spectrum, not because everyone agreed with her positions, but because she had earned something rare in contemporary media: the right to be heard on her own terms, to have her actual ideas engaged with rather than a simplified caricature. Even outlets that disagreed with her politically noted the nuance, complexity, and research underlying her proposals, a stark contrast to how she had initially been framed. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson from what had begun as a routine morning segment, that in an age of carefully crafted narratives, authenticity still cuts through, truth still matters, and sometimes, when you least expect it, the tables turn, not through shouting or outrage or performance, but through preparation, knowledge, and grace. The ripples continued spreading outward, viewers bringing new skepticism to familiar media formats, hosts adjusting approaches to avoid similar exposure, guests arriving better prepared, more strategic, a small but significant shift in the ecosystem of political coverage, not a revolution, but an evolution towards something that at least resembled more honest discourse. Rebecca Palmer continued hosting the morning dialogue, her reputation damaged but not destroyed, her approach subtly modified, though she never publicly acknowledged the changes or their catalyst. And when asked about Karoline in a later interview, she simply said, "We cover many perspectives on our show," and changed the subject, refusing to give the moment additional oxygen, but the avoidance itself spoke volumes about the impact of that unexpected morning, when the curtain was briefly pulled back and millions saw what had always been there, the machinery of manipulation momentarily exposed. 3 months after the interview, a journalism student approached Karoline after a campus speaking event. "I want to do what you did," she said, eyes bright with admiration and purpose. "I want to change how media works." Karoline smiled, placed her hand gently on the young woman's shoulder, then learned to recognize the difference between performance and substance, between reaction and response, between winning an argument and advancing understanding. She paused, considering her next words carefully. The most powerful thing isn't having the last word, it's having the true one. The lesson extending beyond that single interaction, beyond that single interview, to something more fundamental about how we speak to one another, how we listen, how we understand in a world increasingly defined by those who shout the loudest. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act isn't speaking truth to power, but simply speaking truth, clearly, calmly, consistently, even when others are determined not to hear it. If this story resonated with you, remember that real conversations require honesty, not performance. Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that reveal what happens when prepared narratives meet unprepared truth.